G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, and it's probably time to make another drinking video. And for this kind of drinking I need to get a tool. See, it's a tool from out of my pocket in order to open the 750ml bottle of Cooper's, which they assure me is 3.4 standard drinks with 5.8% alcohol. You'll notice we have a glass bottomed pewter mug in the best traditions of European beer drinking. Don't know whether you're aware of the origins of the glass bottom. It dates back to a fellow called Mad King Ludwig in Liechtenstein. Mad King Ludwig in Liechtenstein, he had the theory that big men were frightening. And Mad King Ludwig in Liechtenstein decided that he needed to have an army that was frightening to his neighbours. So he conscripted all the tall men in Liechtenstein. And he didn't have enough tall men. So he sent recruiters all over Europe, basically looking for tall peasants, labourers, people who didn't really have their wits about them, people who worked hard and were huge. And the idea was, invite them into the local tavern and offer them a free drink. What farm labourer won't take a free drink? Not too many that I know of. So the idea is that the recruiter would take a shilling piece, which was a week or more, maybe even a month's wages to a farm labourer, and they would drop the shilling piece into the tankard of beer. So the farm labourer is going to be hit in the mouth with this coin. And because it's free beer, when the recruiter for Mad King Ludwig of Liechtenstein says, "Here's to the health of good King Ludwig," the farm labourer faithfully raises his tankard and drinks to the health of good King Ludwig. And technically, that means that the farm labourer has taken an oath. And when the coin dropped by the recruiter hits him in the mouth, and he fishes it out of his tankard, and he says, "What's this?" That's when he's told that he's joined King Ludwig's army. He's taken an oath of service to the health of good King Ludwig, and he's holding the king's shilling. So they pretty much bind and gag these fellas if they weren't willing, and they'd take them back to Liechtenstein, and they'd dress them up in a fancy blue uniform, and they'd make them march up and down in neat straight rows, beating them, sometimes with hot irons, for any recalcitrance. They weren't much good for fighting, but they were bloody excellent for marching up and down and frightening the neighbours. Mad King Ludwig's army of giants, men over 7 foot tall. And eventually, Mad King Ludwig died. by which time it had become customary all over Europe to have glass bottoms, so that yonder farm boy can hold it up and look at the bottom to see if there's a shilling in there, to see if they're being shanghaied. Press ganged is another word for it. But yeah, eventually Mad King Ludwig died and his army was disbanded because the next king of Liechtenstein had no use for an army of giants who couldn't talk to one another and were very expensive to feed and clothe and house, and all they were really good at was marching in neat straight rows. And the broken up remnants of Mad King Ludwig's army were roaming across Europe for the next 20 years looking for their homeland because they couldn't read and they couldn't write. All they knew was that they lived on a farm a couple of miles outside the village, and they had very little idea of where they had to go to find home. So that's the story of Mad King Ludwig. The sequel was another little man with military daydreams, name of Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte conscripted all the tall men in France. Anybody who was between 15 and 50, who was over 5'8", I think, might have been 5'5", went into the French army. Napoleon took 450,000 pairs of tall French testicles on his Russian expedition. And while he was off prancing around in Russia, he turned 490,000 pairs of tall French testicles into compost. Look at that, dead soldier. So, the height of the average Frenchman fell down to buggery. Englishmen prided themselves on how much taller they were than the frogs for nearly a century. And the French developed an overcompensated national inferiority complex. And they sort of had to demonstrate that they too were a grand nation. And Napoleon had invented the patriotic army. He'd invented the idea of getting a whole bunch of peasants who had 6 weeks military training, and with watered ribbons and trinkets of silk he could lead them off to death and destruction. He completely swamped the old-fashioned armies of veterans, 20-year enlistees. You could have 10,000 20-year veterans in your army, and Napoleon come over the hill with 450,000. And your expert, elite, excellent soldiers would get a sore arm, and eventually they'd be wiped out by the patriotic army. The pan-European response to the patriotic army has been team sport. That's where they get a leader and a deputy leader and a bunch of cannon fodder. And by the numbers you attack the territory of the neighbouring tribe and defend the territory of your own tribe. And you squabble, seeking to compete, looking for control of a symbolic sperm pack. And with that sperm pack you attempt to impregnate the legs at the other end of the field, in the enemy's territorial enclave. And it's a funny thing, but you can't gain employment as a volunteer in the Australian Defence Forces if you tell them you won't play team sport. You tell them you think team sport is for people who sit on their backsides, and they'll say, yeah, well, you're not Defence Force material, are you? They want you in there only if you're capable of thinking as a group. So, with all Europe playing team sport, at the start of the 20th century, they had smokeless powder, they had gas and recoil operated machine guns. They had quick firing artillery. They had aeroplanes. They had steam turbine battleships. They had petrol and diesel powered road transport. They had railguns. They had all kinds of stuff that they hadn't really tested out except on natives. And it wasn't much of a contest, as Kipling put it. When all is said and all is done, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. Which was the story of the colonial wars. So a great contest was held. The 1914-1918 war to end all wars. Pretty much as an end result, well, not even the end result, as a result of Napoleon's policy of copying Mad King Ludwig of Liechtenstein's policy of conscripting all the tall men and turning them into soldiers and getting rid of the material to make a tall Frenchman. National overcompensated inferiority complex, which pretty much made France determined to jump into Russia's defence when Russia declared war on Serbia because Serbia and Austria Hungary were at war, and therefore England was at war. And thus, and because Australia was also at war, and that's why Australia invaded West Papua. Cunning shit war. And World War II was pretty much a refight of World War I. All the same issues, all the same cranky pants individuals. Fighting and dying for nationalistic territorial claims over somebody else's country. The industrialised, mechanised Europeans and North Americans, with the Australians to help, fought over everybody else's resources. How ridiculous. The final indignity was when the French determined they had to be an independent nuclear striking force in order to maintain their national dignity after having been saved from the Germans in the First World War and having been rescued from German occupation in the Second World War and having lost their overseas colonial territories when they were given back to them after the Second World War. The French decided they needed to have some atom bombs so they could feel as big as the Americans. And whereas the English developed their atom bombs and tested them in Australia, the French tested them in the South Pacific Islands. And they used to put nuclear dust sprinkles on my cornflakes when I was a kid. All as a pan-European response to Napoleon copying Mad King Ludwig. Seriously, the history of the 20th century is just insane. And that, to me, makes 1.5 750ml bottles, which is your 40 fluid ounces of 5.8% alcohol content, which is equivalent to the biggest can that Earl has been able to find and talk about. So, I'm not entirely certain, but I think I've done the job, Earl. That's now 1.6, and we're coming up to the 7 minutes. So, Warbles on a lot can drink nearly as good as Earl can.